May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our salvation. Amen. This is a sermon about food. There are all sorts of things it could be a sermon about this morning. We've had 3 readings and a psalm full of rich themes. We're keeping Refreshment Sunday, the day when Lent lightens, and we're reminded of God's unimaginable love. And we've chosen to keep Refreshment Sunday even though we could have chosen to keep Mothering Sunday, and in various ways, including blessing daffodils, to take and to share, we are treating it as Mothering Sunday. And each of these could make several sermons. But this is a sermon about food, and it starts with a story. It's the story of a party that my husband and I were invited to 8 years ago. It was in my last year of ordination training, which, as some of you know, I spent in Berkeley in California on exchange to the Episcopalian seminary there. And one of the seminary faculty, a chap in his mid-70s called John, had retired several times but kept coming back. We know the type. John was single, and every year he had a Boxing Day party at his bungalow in a retirement village in the North Bay. And the year we were there, he invited us. It's a Boxing Day party, very English, he said, just right for you. And anyway, you don't want to be on your own at Christmas. Don't bring anything. One of our other seminary friends had been invited too, so on Boxing Day, the 3 of us got the Bay Area Metro on the wonderfully named Antioch line, got off at Lafayette, not quite knowing what to expect, and John sent one of his friends in a car to pick us up, because public transport in the Bay Area, while better than the rest of America, that's not saying much. So we arrived. This bungalow was absolutely crammed of John's waifs and strays. There were the 3 of us from CDSP, there was the intern from his church, there were some friends from his retirement village, there were some people who were spending Christmas on their own, there was someone visiting him from Hong Kong, there was someone visiting him from India, there was some senior clergy for some reason, there was a missionary briefly home, and in pride of place there was a huge table crammed with food. John had grown up in the South in the 1950s, and there were various things that I had never seen before and have never seen since, including tomato aspic. Has anyone here ever had tomato aspic? I wouldn't. There were more people than would fit in that bungalow, and there was enough food to feed several times that number. This is a story about food. It's not just about food, of course. It's about hospitality and friendship and generosity. It's about someone who could have been lonely, but instead whose life was full. It's about someone who could have been lonely, and because of that had a keen eye for other people who might be lonely. And it's about several people who might have been homesick, or lonely, or felt abandoned, but instead felt welcomed and cared for and valued. And it's a story about food, and that is important. Fraught though food is for many people, there's still something important about sharing food. Eating together gives us something that just talking or even drinking sherry can't quite. And there's something fundamental about human society, about the human instinct to nurture those we love, which is expressed by making food for or giving food to your family, your friends, those you love. The theme of food runs through our readings. In Joshua, there are 3 different kinds of food, all of which speak in some way about the abundant provision of God. The Israelites have just arrived in the Promised Land at this point. The Promised Land has been promised to them as a land flowing with milk and honey, a land where it's not so much their hard work on the farm as God's generosity that feeds them. And having arrived, the first thing they do is keep the Passover. That is, they feast in celebration of the great things God has done for them. Then they eat the produce of the land, And remember, they've only just arrived, so they didn't sow or water or tend the crops that they're eating. At least in the theology of the book of Joshua, it's pure gift from God. And only then does the manna stop. God fed his people for 40 years in the desert with manna, bread from heaven, appearing miraculously day by day. And God feeds them every single day with manna, right up to the point where they have this land flowing with milk and honey, with crops to harvest. The story of the Exodus and the arrival in the promised land is threaded through with food, with God providing for God's people. And so is the story of the prodigal son. In a slightly more complex, more interesting way, it's threaded through with the theme of food. Dissolute living, which I think is a wonderful phrase, is physical self-indulgence, with splendid food, no doubt, among the other pleasures of the flesh on offer in this far-off country. It's misdirected abundance. It's a parody of God's provision. And then a famine comes, and the son has pods among the pigs, who are themselves, of course, going to be food, but food for Gentiles. So having turned away from the father, the son has no access to the father's table. Having tried to be independent, he finds himself dependent on somebody giving him something to eat, and no one gave him anything. But when he realises that he can turn back, he is given something, not pods, but the fatted calf. The father celebrated his son's return to life, the banquet of heaven, where the angels rejoice every time one sinner repents, the abundance of God, who wants to give us not just what we need, but more than we could possibly want. This is an image of God at the head of the table, carving the roast, bringing plateful after plateful to feed God's beloved people. It's an image I'm deliberately using on Mothering Sunday, though not without some trepidation. Today is not the day for sentimental, romanticised images either of God or of mothers. Nobody's relationship with mother or with children is free of complexity, pain or grief. But it is possible to imagine God as our mother, and if that's a helpful image for you, I invite you to do so. If it's not helpful, don't. I think the point stands. And if you do, you don't have to imagine God as your own mother. You certainly shouldn't imagine God as a sentimentalised ideal housewife mother. And I hope we can see that God's abundant provision is neither sentimental nor romanticised. The abundance of God's table is not tray after tray of dainty fairy cakes and sandwiches. Thankfully, it's not tomato aspic either. The abundance of God's table is solid food to help us recover our strength and set us up for hard work ahead. Because this image of God as providing food for God's people is also one of God fiercely determined, in the face of rebellion and pain, to keep offering costly love, costly grace, costly abundance. Costly because God feeds us in the sacrament of the altar, with bread which is God's body broken for us. And the abundance of that sacrament is the abundance of God, the abundance of the banquet of heaven. It's the abundance of the fatted calf, who incidentally has to die for the father and son to feast. It's the abundance of my friend John's Boxing Day party, inviting everybody he could think of who might value it and expecting to feed us all for a week. It does not depend on our worth. It does not depend on our past. It does not depend on our being able to imagine it. It depends only on our realising that we cannot be independent forever. We need to turn to God and allow God to wrap us in an embrace, let us sit at the table and offer us something to eat. And if that's as far as we can get on this Refreshment Sunday, that is enough. We are invited to sit and eat, to rest and be restored for as long as we need to. But when we have the energy to do a bit more, God invites us to look around us at who else is at the table. Jesus gave his life for his friends and calls us, as we share his body, to be a community of friends, of brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, one to the other. To participate in that life-giving, love-giving sharing of food and care which God offers to us. The Eucharist is a family celebration, like the feast of the joyful Father and the prodigal Son. The Eucharist is designed to form us into a family. And finally, when we're ready, when we've been fed, God invites us to look around at who's not at the table, to get up and invite other people to take a seat, knowing that there will always be a chair with our name on it, to leave the banquet and to look for those who are sitting in pigsties, eating pods, waiting for someone to offer them something. And when we get there, to offer a place at God's abundant table. Amen.